Hi, Year 11. This is Miss McIntosh here to talk to you about William Wordsworth and this extract that we have from his poem, The Prelude. As ever, I'm going to make sure that we're thinking about weaponizing it for exam conditions. You only have 20 minutes to sound brilliant, and that means you have time to do the following things: summarize the poem's approach to the theme that's identified in the question, put the poem and author in context, and explains how that shapes the poem's approach to the theme. Don't just tell us about vague details about the autobiography or vaguely when it was written, but why it matters. Right, so the soldier matters that Rupert Brooke had never got to war and was on his way to war. That's why it's a poem that's so unquestioningly in love with war and death. And with the prelude, as you'll see, context really matters here as well. Say something clever about the title if relevant, not always relevant. Explain the form and structure, but then how it reflects the poem's approach to the theme. As we'll see in this one, form and structure very, very, very much correspond to the theme and how it's expressed. And then you really have time to do some lovely sort of deep dive language analysis of not very much. Your anthologies are universally over annotated. It's overwhelming to try and work from them. So keep in mind, you really only have time to maybe have like 6 tiny quotations as you move from the beginning of poem to the end. But because the bit you always forget, always, all of you, is the context, and again, it's 33%, we're going to start with that. So the key point about the prelude that you may not know but makes a huge difference is that it's a posthumous poem. It's not published until after his death. He worked on it for his entire life, from 1799, back when William Blake was writing London and other poems, until his death in 1850, and it was published after his death. It's an epic poem, 14 chapters long, right? So the length of a novel, and it's all about William Wordsworth. So it's all about William Wordsworth from his birth, and in fact, he has a section about before he was born, about how the soul might exist before it enters the body, up until he becomes, 18 or 19 and a young man. And the whole idea here is that, as I've put down at the bottom, the child is father of the man, which is a Wordsworth quotation. What we go through as children, your experiences and personality as a child, will determine the adult you grow up to be. So he is investigating his whole life in poetic form, everything from, as we see here, the time he went ice skating with his friends and realized that one day he would grow up and die, to when he's a young man going to the fair in London, which is actually my favorite section, to when the French Revolution was happening and what he thought about it, what thrill it was that day to be alive, and to be young was a very heaven, he said, very unlike Blake. But now, at the end of his life, now it's tempting to think how incredibly self-indulgent and self-important you are, Wordsworth, and I sympathise, and secretly I totally agree. I'm not a big fan of Billy Wordsworth. But remember, this is not written for the public. This isn't published till after his death. And there at the bottom, you've got one of the working books that formed the Prelude. He worked on it over and over and over again throughout his life. So really almost like a diary, a journal, an intense exploration of who he was. And that shapes everything about the poem. Normally, we're very careful with you to say, don't confuse the poet with the poetic voice within the poem. So never take Valentine by Carol Ann Duffy and think that that's Carol Ann Duffy speaking. That was a dramatic moment. That's his statement. Or don't look at The Manhunt and confuse Simon Armitage with the character he's speaking. It's written for a specific person. In this instance, it's autobiographical. You can talk about words. This is what Wordsworth imagined he felt when he was. What's the form of the prelude? Why does it matter? Again, you never need to mention form if you can't think of anything to say about it. Don't just keep it there. But in fact, there's something quite significant to say. The whole form of the poem is, and I'll just see some of the key points I've picked out here. It's a first person autobiographical account of a childhood experience. It's a memory of an emotion, and the quotation I've got there at the bottom, if you want to be super clever about Wordsworth, or for some reason you fall in love with Wordsworth, you could remember that one, that poetry is emotion recollected in tranquility. And that's reflected in the form because it's a regular form, it's blank verse, it's unrhymed iambic pentameter, which is most of what Macbeth is written in. So particular rhythm that makes it sound like natural speech, lots of caesura and enjambment in the middle of lines, but at the same time, this slow, measured pace. So an ordered, calm meter, however dramatic the psychological events Wordsworth is describing, is remember and writing about them from an adult distance. It's a sort of form of analysis that he's got going on. This is exactly the same. The poem that it most closely matches up with in our anthology, which is Seamus Heaney's Death of a Naturalist, which is also emotion recollected in tranquility. Heaney looking back, the voice looking back at an experience from childhood where he went from being an innocent child, a naturalist, to being someone threatened by nature, realizing that puberty and death and adult life existed. And yet they're both written in blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter, because they're controlled reflections on the past. Then analyze 3 to 4 moments in the poem about which you can be cleverest. I've got that unfortunate school who made a beautiful guide to the anthology that we've all stolen, and the last page says, please don't steal this anthology. Tough luck, school, you shouldn't have put it on the internet. I've screen capped their thing here. Do by all means pause it and go through it if your poem isn't annotated. But there's too much annotated here. You can't discuss all of these things. So a key point here, it's the frosty season. So we've got an extended metaphor, just like in every other nature poem, as we'll see when I take you to the next slide. We've got the same metaphor going on in afternoons, Death of a Naturalist, as imperceptibly as grief, and to autumn, which is the human life is symbolized by the seasons and by the day. So over the course of the poem, we go into the nighttime, symbolizing the end stage of human life, and it's in the winter, symbolizing death. Now, in this one, unlike if you're going to compare it to Keats, Keats is writing when he knows he's dying. So that is a much more lyrical and personal and deeply moving, for me, exploration of what death means, what it means to be finding a way to appreciate the beauty of dying when you are far too young to die. Wordsworth, of course, lives to a ripe old age. He's the only romantic who grows up. Everybody else dies young and beautiful in their 20s or early 30s. Wordsworth has the misfortune and the great fortune to live to be an old establishment man. He's the poet laureate, all kinds of things. So here he's talking about his childhood when he realizes that mortality exists, that human life is limited, and that nature is a huge, howling, grand emptiness inside which he is tiny and small and insignificant. That's a very abstract and intellectual way of understanding death, completely different to John Keats's I've just coughed up blood in my handkerchief and I know that I'm dying way of contemplating death. So that's your frosty season. You'll notice that it's outside. We start off outside near the cottage window. Wordsworth, of course, is associated with a particular landscape, the Lake District, or Wordsworth country, we even call it now. Like all the other romantics, but especially him, he defines human life and his experience of life very much through his interaction with nature. And that's also like Seamus Heaney, isn't it, in Death of a Naturalist, where he has quite a specific Irish landscape that he's always going back to and talking about. I will point out here the use of plural pronouns, us, we, the fact that down here, this anthology hasn't highlighted it, but we've got down here, confederate, meaning brothers together. So he and the other village children are all moving together, but at some point we shift to I. And what we're having here is there's a fairly standard trope of the early 19th century, the 18th century, which is the sublime. And that's the idea that you can have a moment in nature that is bigger than you. You should know it from chemistry that subliming is when something goes from a solid state straight to a gas state, skipping liquid in the middle. So that's a sort of metaphoric usage here, where you go from being stolid, everyday Billy Wordsworth, the boy skating, to being, I've had a huge mystical spiritual experience. I feel the extent of my soul. That's what it's about. He has an epiphany in the middle of a sublime experience. We shift tonally down at the bottom where that happens. Through the darkness and the cold we flew. Meanwhile, the precipices rang aloud, the leafless trees and every icy crag tinkled like iron. Here is where he's realizing that death is coming. Nature is huge. I've been sublimed. And we can see that in phonological sound-based features like harsh plosives and onomatopoeia, tinkling like iron, rang aloud. So, and then into the tumults, then an alien sound of melancholy, right? So sadness, the innocence of childhood is ending here, even though it's beautiful. Right? There's stars eastward were sparkling clear, and the west, the orange sky of evening died away. His perspective pulls out from being down on the ground, skating with the other boys, to the mountains around him, and then up even to the heavens. And then the orange sky of evening is dying away. You've got that metaphoric usage of dying there, which is giving us a key word for how it applies to him. Now, I've taken you quite quickly through this poem because I think it's one of those that once you understand what's going on, you can skip through quite quickly, having sounded very clever as you were doing it. But as I said, there's lots of lovely stuff here to analyze. I'm just going to take you straight through to how I would approach writing that up. So summarize the poem's approach to the theme, winter is coming. As in every single other one, as I've said, they're all about winter is coming. Autumn, summer is fading, it literally says. As imperceptibly as grief, the summer slipped away or passed away, Emily Dickinson says. To autumn literally is about to autumn. Afternoons, summer is fading. So winter is coming, autumn is coming. And as we've summarized it here, and as I say in all of my versions of this, death is approaching. The poet remembers the sublime experience in his childhood, which led to the epiphany that death is coming, that humans are mortal. Obviously, winter is coming is my bad joke about Game of Thrones. Please don't use that in your exam technique. Poem and author in context. William Wordsworth was an English romantic poet writing in the first decades of the 19th century. He's associated with a specific landscape, the Lake District. Like other romantics, he takes inspiration from nature. This poem is taken from an epic book-length poem about his own damn self in a chapter about his childhood. I hate Wordsworth. As you'll notice, some of my own opinions on Wordsworth came through there. Don't include those. Form, structure, and how it reflects approach to theme. The poem is written in blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter. However extreme the emotions Wordsworth's remembering, he presents them in fixed, ordered form. Poetry, he says elsewhere, is emotion recollected in tranquility. Clever comment about the title. Childhood experience is a prelude to adult reflection. And then zoom through, looking at the shift from the pronouns we, us, the noun, the adjective confederate, through to I, me, someone was noticing. Because one of the things that Wordsworth is doing in the whole prelude, is looking at what makes him so special. What makes Billy Wordsworth the boy who noticed death when all the other boys were skating around? What makes Billy Wordsworth the boy who goes on to be a great romantic poet, one of the greatest poets of his generation, the poet laureate, the man whose name will live forever, the man who's on the English curriculum for every single year 11 in the nation? Why is he different and special? What has he noticed that all the other boys haven't? So it's a poem as much about himself and his capacity to notice and feel things about nature as it is about the nature of mortality and life itself. And that is all I have to say about Mr. William Wordsworth.